"Mr. Sterling, that baby isn't just throwing a tantrum. That little angel is losing strength." Alexander Sterling froze in the middle of his mansion, his son Matthew trembling in his arms, thin, red from crying so much, and refusing the bottle as if every drop caused him pain. 5 doctors, 8 nannies, and a house filled with luxury hadn't been enough to save the most cherished heir in Greenwich. Then Elena Santos, the newly arrived employee, lowered her gaze and said something no one expected. "Let me try just once, and if it doesn't work, I'll leave forever." She wore no white coat, had no money, no prominent last name. She only held a secret hidden beneath her uniform, a secret capable of nourishing the baby everyone had given up for lost. But if Alexander discovered the truth, Elena could lose everything. Sterling Manor, in one of Greenwich's most exclusive neighborhoods, seemed to have it all. Italian marble, perfectly manicured gardens, armored cars at the entrance, and employees moving silently, as if even breathing too loudly could break something. But behind such luxury lived an anguish that Alexander Sterling's money could neither buy nor cure. His son, Matthew Sterling, barely 5 months old, wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, and cried with a desperation that shook the walls from dawn until night. The child's mother was gone. Nannies resigned one after another. Doctors spoke of colic, reflux, stress, elegant theories that changed nothing, and the paternal grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, insisted the problem was a lack of discipline in a house where everyone feared touching the air. That Monday, Elena Santos arrived for the first time as a cleaning employee, in her borrowed uniform, worn shoes, and an old bag clutched to her chest. She wasn't seeking miracles, just a salary to avoid falling back into destitution. But hearing Matthew's cries from the second floor, something inside her silently broke, as if that baby was calling to a part of her life no one knew. Elena tried to obey the rules, keep her gaze down, and mop the hallways without getting involved where she wasn't called. But each cry from the child pierced her soul with a question impossible to ignore. Before continuing, tell me in the comments from which city or country you're watching this story, and subscribe because what's coming will break your heart. Because when Alexander descended the stairs with Matthew nearly lifeless in his arms, Elena understood that this mansion didn't need another nurse or another medical explanation. It needed someone brave enough to listen to the baby's pain before it was too late. Alexander Sterling appeared at the top of the stairs with Matthew in his arms, but he didn't look like the owner of one of Greenwich's most powerful families. He looked like a defeated father. The baby, barely 5 months old, had a red face, swollen eyes, and a trembling body against his chest. In Alexander's hand, the bottle remained almost full, like all the others. Behind him came the on-duty nurse, with a crumpled uniform, a sweaty brow, and the look of someone who no longer knew what else to try. The entire mansion seemed to hold its breath, because when Matthew cried, even luxury became useless. Elena Santos stood in the corridor with a damp rag in her hands, pretending to clean a table that already gleamed like a mirror. It was her first day at Sterling Manor, and the housekeeper had already made the rules clear. Clean, obey, don't ask, and never meddle in family affairs. But Matthew's cries cut through doors, walls, and warnings. It wasn't a tantrum, not a whim. It was a tired, desperate sound, as if the child was crying for help in a language no one wanted to learn. The nurse tried to explain that she had followed all instructions, warmed the formula, changed positions, played soft music, paused, tried another bottle, and even attempted small amounts with a spoon. Nothing worked. Matthew pushed the bottle with his tongue, turned his face away, and cried until he ran out of breath. Alexander clenched his jaw with a rage that wasn't just directed at the nurse, but at his own helplessness. He had paid the best doctors, hired nannies with impeccable references, and filled the house with remedies, gadgets, and advice. But his son still wouldn't eat. Eleanor Sterling, seated in the living room with a rosary clutched in her fingers, watched the scene with a hardened face. To her, so much crying was a lack of order. She said Matthew was held too much, that babies also needed to get used to the house rules, that mothers back then didn't make such a fuss over a crying child. Elena felt something burning in her chest. A 5-month-old baby doesn't manipulate anyone. A baby suffers, feels, needs. But she was just the new employee, a humble woman with worn shoes and an old bag stowed in the kitchen. In that house, her opinion was worth less than silence. Still, when Matthew let out a whimper so faint it seemed to vanish into the air, Elena couldn't stay still. She took a step toward the stairs without realizing it. The housekeeper looked at her in alarm, as if begging her not to commit an imprudence. Alexander noticed the movement and turned to her with annoyance. "What do you want?" he asked dryly. Elena swallowed. She felt all eyes on her uniform, on her hands, on her place in that house. She knew she could lose her job before finishing her first day, but she also knew that staying silent then was to abandon the child. "Mr. Sterling, that baby isn't just throwing a tantrum, that little angel is losing strength." A heavy silence fell. Eleanor let out a cold, almost offensive laugh. The nurse lowered her gaze. Alexander looked at Elena as if she had crossed a forbidden line. "And what do you know?" he said, his voice hard. "Now a cleaning employee knows more than the nurses and doctors who have seen my son." Elena felt the sting of humiliation, but she didn't raise her voice. She said she didn't mean to be disrespectful, that she only saw a baby who was too tired, a baby who perhaps didn't need more pressure, but a different kind of care. Alexander didn't let her finish. He ordered her back to her work and added that if he needed an opinion, he would call another specialist, not a stranger who had just entered the house. Elena lowered her gaze. Poverty had taught her to swallow her words, even when they hurt more than hunger. That same afternoon, Alexander fired the nurse. The woman left crying through the front door, defeated like all the previous ones, while Matthew continued to cry on the second floor. Eleanor insisted the problem was the caregiver's incompetence, not the family's. Alexander, desperate, called a private agency and requested the best available nanny, someone with real experience, someone who wouldn't break down before a difficult baby. Hours later, Carol Jenkins arrived, a nanny renowned for having worked with prominent families in New York City, Boston, and Los Angeles. She was impeccable, with her hair pulled back, a calm voice, and a self-assurance that seemed to restore some hope to the mansion. Carol carefully took Matthew, checked his temperature, requested absolute silence, changed the room's lighting, prepared another formula, and assured them that the child would have eaten and slept before nightfall. Eleanor smiled for the first time all day, convinced that now the baby was in the right hands. Elena heard everything from the kitchen, while washing exquisite cups she feared breaking. She tried to convince herself it was better this way. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps a woman like Carol could indeed solve what she only dimly sensed. Perhaps Matthew just needed experience, not the painful premonition of an employee no one would take seriously. But 2 hours later, the crying returned. First, it was a low whimper, then a desperate sob, then a cry so fragile and so profound that it made Elena close her eyes by the sink. Carol came down shortly after, her face pale, no longer appearing confident. She said Matthew rejected everything, that it wasn't normal, that there was something about that baby that didn't respond to any known method. Alexander looked at her with fury, but this time he didn't even have the strength to yell. Carol didn't ask for another chance. She just handed over the child and uttered a phrase that chilled the room. Matthew needed something no one in that house was managing to give him. At the end of her shift, Elena returned home on a crowded bus, her body tired and her soul trapped in that mansion. The lights of Greenwich blurred past the window, but she only heard Matthew's cries. She thought of his exhausted little face, the way he rejected the bottle, that tiny mouth movement searching for something it couldn't find. She knew Alexander would never allow a simple employee near his son. To him, she cleaned floors, she didn't save heirs, and yet, something within Elena told her that if no one listened to the child soon, Sterling Manor would lose much more than its tranquility. And the next morning, when Elena arrived at the mansion, she found Alexander in the main corridor, without his jacket, without his tie, and almost without hope. Matthew was in his arms, weaker than the day before, crying softly, as if he no longer had the strength even to call for help. The house, which had once seemed cold and impeccable, now seemed scared. Eleanor prayed in the living room, her rosary clutched between her fingers, but her voice no longer sounded like faith, it sounded like fear. Elena looked at the baby, then at Alexander, and carefully asked if no other nanny or nurse would be coming that day. Alexander let out a bitter laugh, one of those that arises when pain is tired of being pain. He said no agency wanted to send anyone else to Sterling Manor. Some spoke of staff shortages, others simply hung up, and one of them, without the courage to disguise it, had said their caregivers didn't work with doomed cases. The word hung in the air like a curse. Doomed. Matthew Sterling, the heir to a fortune capable of buying doctors, remedies, and entire hospital wings, was being treated as a baby no one else wanted to try to save. Elena felt her chest tighten. She didn't know if it was bravery or madness, but she took a step forward and spoke softly, without challenging Alexander, without humiliating him in front of everyone. "Mr. Sterling, if there's no one else left, let me try just once." Eleanor immediately rose, indignant. saying Alexander couldn't entrust his son to a mere employee, that this woman knew nothing about children, much less a sterling. But Alexander no longer had the strength to defend the family's pride. He looked at Matthew's pale face, the rejected bottle on the table, and then at Elena, who trembled with fear but didn't take her eyes off the baby. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then Matthew let out a whimper so small that it seemed to extinguish the last bit of resistance in Alexander's heart. With trembling hands, he handed his son to Elena, still not entirely trusting her, still afraid of committing the worst folly of his life. Elena slowly extended her arms. Even before being handed over, Matthew turned his little head toward her, as if recognizing something no one else could see. And when Alexander placed the baby in the arms of that employee, the entire mansion fell silent, because for the first time in many months, no one knew if a miracle or a tragedy was about to occur. When Alexander Sterling placed Matthew in Elena Santos's arms, no one in the mansion dared to move. Eleanor stood in the middle of the living room, her rosary clutched in her fingers and her mouth slightly agape, as if she had just witnessed an insult against everything her last name stood for. Sarah, the housekeeper, watched the scene with fear, ready to run if the baby worsened. And Alexander, his hands still suspended in the air, seemed to regret it even before he had fully released his son. Elena received the child with a delicacy that didn't seem learned from manuals but from hardship. She didn't adjust him like the nurses, didn't move him in a hurry, didn't immediately try to give him the bottle, nor did she speak to him in that fake voice many adults use when they want to force a baby to calm down. She just gently pressed him against her chest, supported his tiny head with the palm of her hand, and began to breathe slowly, very slowly, as if she wanted to teach Matthew the way back to calm. The baby continued to cry at first, but it was no longer the desperate wail that had shaken the house for months. It was a broken, confused cry, as if his little body didn't understand why someone was suddenly holding him without demanding anything. Elena closed her eyes for an instant and murmured soft, almost imperceptible words, with the tone of a woman who knows how to lull before knowing how to defend herself. "There, my darling. I hear you. You don't have to fight alone." Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. No one had spoken to Matthew like that. Everyone talked about the baby, about his symptoms, his weight, his schedule, his problem. Elena spoke to him, as if behind the crying there was a small person tired of no one understanding him. Matthew moved his little mouth against the employee's uniform, searching for something with a desperation so small and so ancient that Elena stiffened for just a second. It was a tiny movement, but Alexander noticed it. Eleanor did too. "What is she doing?" the lady asked suspiciously. Elena didn't respond immediately. She adjusted the baby better, rocked him gently, and began to sing a very soft lullaby, an old folk melody, one of those that don't come from the radio but from grandmothers. Sarah, who was from a small southern town, recognized something in that song and lowered her gaze respectfully. It wasn't an elegant song, it was a song of hearth, of yard, of women who have cared for children, while the world demanded they keep standing, even if they were broken inside. Little by little, Matthew stopped squirming. His tiny hands, which had been tightly clenched, loosened on Elena's chest. The crying turned into a sob, then a trembling sigh, then silence, but not an empty silence like that of the mansion before he was born. It was a living, fragile, almost sacred silence. Alexander stepped forward, incredulous. "It can't be," he whispered. "No one has ever managed that." Eleanor frowned, more uneasy than grateful. "Babies get tired of crying, Alexander. Don't make this a miracle." But Alexander couldn't take his eyes off his son. Matthew, who had rejected arms, voices, bottles, and specialists, was still against Elena, breathing with his face hidden in her simple uniform. He wasn't fully asleep, but for the first time, he didn't seem to be fighting the world. He seemed to be listening to a heart that was telling him something no one else knew how to say. Elena felt the weight of all eyes. She knew she should hand the child back soon, before they accused her of wanting to occupy a place that didn't belong to her. But every time she tried to separate him a little, Matthew clung to the fabric of her blouse with desperate strength, as if fearing to fall back into the same void as before. That gesture made Elena's eyes well up with tears, and she lowered her face so no one would notice, because there were things she couldn't say. She couldn't tell them that before coming to Sterling Manor, she had spent entire nights listening to a silence worse than any crying. She couldn't say that she knew the pain of waiting for a baby who never opened his eyes in her arms. She couldn't explain that her body still held a memory her soul didn't know how to accept, and much less could she reveal that since childhood, her grandma Rosa, a respected midwife in a small town in rural Georgia, had taught her to understand newborns by the way they breathed, searched, cried, rejected. Elena had cared for other people's children since she was 14. She had carried feverish babies, bathed restless twins, calmed creatures crying from hunger, fear, absence. Her grandmother told her that a baby never lies, that when a child cries like that, the body is telling a truth that adults don't want to hear. That's why, when she saw Matthew, Elena didn't see a whim. She saw a need. She saw abandonment hidden beneath luxury. She saw a call. Alexander approached carefully. "How did you know what to do?" Elena looked up. For a second, she wanted to tell the truth, to release all the pain clutched in her chest, to confess that it wasn't magic or luck, but a wound that had transformed her into a woman capable of recognizing a baby's suffering, even from another room. But Eleanor was there, looking at her as if she were already trying to find a way to get rid of her. Sarah was, so Elena only responded, "Sometimes babies don't need you to conquer them, they need you to listen to them." Alexander swallowed. That phrase disarmed him more than any diagnosis. For months, he had tried to conquer Matthew's crying, to defeat it with money, with doctors, with schedules, with authority. Elena, however, had arrived with nothing and had done the only thing no one else had tried: surrender to the child's pain to understand him. Matthew moved his little mouth against Elena's chest again. This time with more clarity, she felt her blood run cold. She knew what he was looking for. She knew it too well, but she couldn't do anything there in front of everyone without turning her secret into a scandal. So she adjusted him again, sang more softly, and silently begged the baby to calm down a little more. Alexander, still impressed, ordered Elena to stay with Matthew for a few hours, just while he found another solution. Eleanor immediately protested, saying that an employee couldn't accidentally become a nanny, that something about that connection was too strange, too fast, too dangerous. But Alexander didn't listen to her. For the first time in months, his son wasn't screaming. Elena sat in a rocking chair near the window with Matthew pressed against her chest, her soul trembling with fear. She knew she had only won a moment, not a permanent place. She knew that if Alexander discovered everything she was hiding, he might throw her out of the mansion forever. But she also knew that Matthew was still searching for something no bottle had given him. And as the baby rested against her, everyone in Sterling Manor began to ask themselves the same question in silence. What did that woman have in her arms, in her voice, in her gaze? And what great suffering had she lived through to understand Matthew, as if the child's crying were also hers? The question lingered in Sterling Manor throughout the afternoon. What did Elena Santos have that Matthew couldn't find in anyone else? Alexander tried to convince himself it had been a coincidence, born of the baby's exhaustion, but every time someone tried to separate him from her, the child would become restless again. He didn't cry, with the same strength as before, but let out small whimpers, clenched his tiny fists against Elena's uniform, and moved his mouth searching for something she understood too well. That gesture made her pale because it wasn't a whim, nor a habit, nor a simple need for cuddles. Matthew was asking for nourishment, in the only way his little body knew how. Alexander had another formula prepared, ordered another bottle, called the pediatrician, and heard the same explanations as always. Perhaps it was reflux. Perhaps the baby associated the bottle with pain, that they should persist patiently, measure the temperature, try another brand, note the times. Elena listened in silence from the rocking chair with Matthew finally calm against her chest. Every word from the doctor sounded distant to her, as if they were talking about an imaginary child, and not the baby in her arms, weak, hungry, and desperate for something no store-bought bottle could give him. Eleanor didn't take her eyes off her. She watched her from the living room, as one watches an intruder who has just entered through an unopened door. She didn't like the way Matthew calmed down with Elena. She didn't like that Alexander, a man accustomed to giving orders, now looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. And even less did she like that a cleaning employee, with worn shoes and a common last name, had achieved in minutes what trained professionals hadn't managed in months. To Eleanor, this was not a miracle, it was a threat. When it was time to try feeding him again, Alexander approached with the bottle in his hand. Elena held Matthew carefully, trying not to show the fear rising in her throat. The baby touched the tip of the bottle with his lips, wrinkled his face, and turned his head toward her, seeking her warmth, her smell, her breast. Alexander despaired, asking her to try a little more. Elena obeyed, but Matthew began to cry again, softly at first, then with an anguish that seemed to return the entire house to its usual nightmare. Then she knew she couldn't keep pretending. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice trembling, "perhaps he needs a little air. He's very nervous with everyone watching him." Alexander hesitated. Eleanor immediately rose, saying no Sterling family baby, left the house in the arms of a stranger, but Matthew cried with such weakness that the phrase lost strength before it finished. Elena promised she would only take him to the garden, that Sarah could accompany her if they wished, that she wouldn't stray from the mansion. Alexander looked at his son, looked at the rejected bottle, and, overcome by a sadness he could no longer hide, he accepted. Elena went out to the back garden with Matthew, wrapped in a thin blanket. Sarah followed a few steps but stopped when Eleanor called her from the living room, ordering her to monitor some important calls. For the first time since she had taken the baby, Elena was alone with him, in the shade of the trees, away from prying eyes, away from the marble, away from the last name that weighed on that creature, like a crown too. Big, Matthew cried against her, moving his mouth desperately. Elena felt tears burning her eyes. "Oh, my child," she whispered. "I know what you're looking for." She sat on a bench hidden among bougainvillea, her heart pounding so hard she feared someone would hear it from the house. She looked toward the windows. No one was coming. No one saw her. Then, with trembling hands, she adjusted the blanket to cover the baby and offered him what she had tried to deny since entering that mansion: breast milk. There was no scandal, no visible magic, just a baby who suddenly stopped crying and clung to her with such profound need that Elena had to bite her lips to keep from sobbing. The world stopped in that garden. Matthew fed with a soul-breaking urgency, as if he had been waiting for that relief for too long. Elena held him tenderly, covering him with the blanket, crying silently, because her body, which for weeks had reminded her of an impossible-to-name loss, now served to save another child. She didn't allow herself to say the name of the baby she had lost aloud. She didn't allow herself to break down. She just stroked Matthew's head and spoke softly, as if swearing a promise no one else should hear. "Eat, my little angel. I'm here. You're not alone." When Matthew finished, his breathing changed. It was no longer that choppy, restless, desperate air. It was a slow, satisfied, new breath. He fell asleep against her with a peace the mansion hadn't known for months. Elena remained motionless, looking at his calm face, feeling at once immense gratitude and terrible fear, because she had just crossed a line Alexander would never have authorized if he had known the truth. She had done it to save the baby, yes, but she also knew that if anyone discovered how she had fed him, they could accuse her of anything. She re-entered the mansion with Matthew asleep in her arms. Alexander stood in the corridor, pacing back and forth like a man who had forgotten how to wait. Seeing the sleeping child, he froze. He didn't ask at first. He just approached slowly, his eyes filled with an emotion he didn't want to show in front of his mother. "Did he eat?" he finally asked. Elena felt the lie catch in her throat. She looked down at Matthew, and then at the bottle that remained on the table, untouched, silently accusing her. "He had a little bit," she replied. Then he fell asleep. Alexander closed his eyes in relief, but Eleanor narrowed hers. Something didn't add up. The bottle seemed just as full. The baby was sleeping too peacefully, and Elena, though she tried to appear calm, had a damp face, trembling hands, and an emotion that didn't fit a simple employee who had just walked a child in the garden. That night, Alexander asked Elena to return the next day, not just to clean, but to help with Matthew while they found a definitive solution. Elena accepted with her head down, knowing that solution already existed, but it lived hidden in her own body and in her pain. As she left the mansion, she clutched her bag to her chest and walked towards the bus stop, her soul torn between relief and fear. Because Matthew had eaten, Matthew had slept, Matthew was alive. But from a second-story window, Eleanor watched her leave, a suspicion growing in her eyes. And before Elena turned the corner, Mrs. Sterling picked up the phone and said in a cold voice, "I need you to investigate that woman. I want to know what Elena Santos is hiding, and I want to know before my son trusts her again." Eleanor Sterling did not sleep peacefully that night. She walked through her room, phone still in hand, occasionally looking out at the mansion's lit garden, as if expecting to discover there the answer to the mystery that troubled her. For anyone else, what had happened would have been a cause for relief. Matthew had stopped crying. He had slept for several hours straight. And Alexander, for the first time in months, no longer seemed like a man condemned to watch his son suffer helplessly. But for Eleanor, that calm wasn't natural. It was too fast, too convenient, too dangerous. Since Matthew's mother's death, Mrs. Sterling had convinced herself that no one was worthy of getting too close to the child, neither nannies nor nurses, not even Alexander. whom she silently accused of being weak for allowing himself to be overcome by his own son's crying. Eleanor couldn't stand the idea of losing control within the mansion. And now a newly arrived employee, a girl with no prominent last name, no elegant education, and an old bag on her shoulder, had achieved what the family's money couldn't buy. To her, this wasn't a blessing, it was a humiliation. The next morning, Elena arrived early, her uniform clean, and her heart filled with fear. As soon as she crossed the gate, she felt that the mansion no longer looked at her the same way. The employees whispered less. Sarah avoided asking her questions, and Eleanor greeted her from the living room with a smile so cold it seemed rehearsed in front of a mirror. Alexander, on the other hand, descended the stairs with Matthew in his arms, and an expression Elena hadn't seen before. Tiredness, yes, but also hope. The baby was restless, searching with his mouth, making small sounds that only increased Elena's anguish. "Good morning," Alexander said, approaching. "He had a better night, didn't he? He slept almost 4 hours." Elena felt a mixture of relief and guilt. She wanted to be happy, but she knew that peace rested on a secret. She carefully took Matthew when Alexander allowed it, and the child immediately clung to her, as if recognizing not only her arms, but the hidden promise within them. Eleanor observed the gesture from afar and pursed her lips. She didn't like seeing her grandson cling to a stranger with such trust. She didn't like that Alexander noticed it with emotion. She didn't like that the house's silence now depended on Elena. Throughout the morning, Elena tried to maintain a discreet routine. She sang softly, walked the corridors with Matthew in her arms, rocked him near the windows, and pretended to prepare bottles that the baby continued to reject. Every time Alexander asked if he had eaten anything, she responded with half-truths. "A little bit. He's calmer. We're going slowly." She didn't tell a complete lie, but she didn't tell the whole truth either. And that boundary, as thin as a thread, weighed more heavily on her with each passing hour. When Matthew began to cry more desperately, Elena asked to take him to the garden to calm down. Alexander was about to accept immediately, but Eleanor intervened with poisonous sweetness. She said it was too hot, that the child could catch a cold if he sweated and then entered the air conditioning, that it was better to feed him in the living room in front of everyone, as should be done in a respectable house. Elena felt her face grow cold. She understood that Eleanor was not worried about the weather. She was closing the doors to the secret. Alexander looked at his mother with weariness, but he didn't want to argue. He asked Elena to try the bottle one more time. Matthew rejected it instantly. He cried with such profound frustration that Alexander ran a hand over his face. Eleanor was unmoved. On the contrary, she observed Elena, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. The employee held the baby against her chest, trying to calm him without making his search obvious. Matthew turned his face, opened his mouth, despaired. Elena felt something break inside her. "Please, Mr. Sterling," she finally said, her voice cracking. "Let me take him to the back patio for a few minutes. He's getting more agitated with so many people." Alexander hesitated for just a second, then nodded. Eleanor wanted to protest, but he stopped her with a look. "Mother, let her. If Matthew calms down with her, I won't prevent it." That phrase fell like a declaration of war. Elena left with the baby wrapped in a blanket, walking as slowly as possible to avoid suspicion. But this time, Eleanor didn't stay still. She waited a few seconds, approached Sarah, and asked if the back patio had cameras. The uncomfortable housekeeper replied that it did, but that some old areas of the garden were out of angle. Eleanor said nothing more. She just smiled with a calm that was frightening. On the bench hidden among bougainvillea, Eleanor fed Matthew again in secret. She did it trembling, looking towards the windows, covering him with the blanket, praying that no one would appear. The baby clung to her with hunger and relief, and Elena closed her eyes to keep from crying too loudly. In that instant, she didn't think of Alexander or Eleanor. She thought of the tiny body that was finally ceasing to struggle, of his breathing becoming calm, of life returning to his face drop by drop. If this was a sin, Elena didn't know how to repent. But upon returning to the mansion, she noticed something different. Eleanor was no longer in the living room. Sarah was nervous. Alexander received a sleeping Matthew with such honest relief that it pained Elena to deceive him. He thanked her in a low voice and said he didn't understand how much could change in her arms. Elena lowered her gaze. She wanted to tell him it wasn't just in her arms, that there was a reason, that the secret hadn't been born of malice but of a loss that still haunted her. But fear closed her throat. That afternoon, while Elena folded blankets in the service room, she heard voices in the study. The door was ajar. Eleanor was on the phone with someone named Mike Thompson, a private investigator who, according to her words, had already begun to review Elena's past. The lady wanted to know where she had worked, with whom she lived, why she didn't talk about her family, and, above all, what had happened in her life before arriving at Sterling Manor. Elena stood still, a blanket clutched in her hands. She felt the air leave her lungs. Her past wasn't a crime, but it was an open wound. There were things she didn't want to see turned into rich people's gossip. The humble home where she grew up, the midwife, grandmother who raised her, the children she cared for since adolescence, and especially that baby she had lost before she could say his name aloud without breaking. If Eleanor discovered that, she would use it against her. She would say Elena was confusing Matthew with a son she didn't have. She would say her love was an illness. She would say anything to get her out of the house. When she left the room, Alexander found her pale in the hallway. He asked if she was okay. Elena tried to smile, but her eyes betrayed her. Matthew slept in his room, peaceful for the first time in a long time. And that silence, which should have been peace, became a threat. Because Elena understood that saving the baby wasn't enough. Now she would also have to protect the secret that kept him alive. And as she lowered her gaze to keep from crying in front of Alexander, in the mansion's study, Eleanor received the investigator's first message. "Madam, I've found something. Elena Santos lost a baby recently, and that changes everything." The investigator's message arrived on Eleanor's phone, as if it were the key she had been waiting for days. "Elena Santos lost a baby recently, and that changes everything." Mrs. Sterling read those words again and again, not with compassion, but with a chilling coldness. For any other woman, that news would have evoked pity, respect, silence. But for Eleanor, it was an opportunity. If Elena had lost a child, then she was no longer just an employee who had calmed Matthew. She was a wounded woman, a vulnerable woman, a woman who could be accused of confusing pain with love. That night, as Alexander ate dinner, barely touching his plate, Eleanor placed a folder on the dining room table. She didn't do it quickly. She did it slowly, calculating the sound of the paper against the fine wood, waiting for her son to look up. Alexander was exhausted, but Matthew had slept better again, and that gave him a fragile peace he didn't want to lose. When he saw the folder, he sighed. "Mother, if this is another complaint against Elena, I don't have the strength." Eleanor was unperturbed. She told him that precisely because of Matthew, he needed to listen to her, not as a controlling mother, but as a concerned grandmother. Alexander didn't respond, but he opened the folder. Inside were reports, names of families, addresses of exclusive neighborhoods in Greenwich and other cities, dates, blurry photographs, and comments written with a tone too confident to be innocent. Mike Thompson, the investigator, had traced Elena's previous jobs, and what he found, or what Eleanor wanted to present as truth, was enough to sow poison. Elena had previously worked in 3 high-society homes. In the first, the Prescott family accused her of taking a gold bracelet from their youngest daughter's room. There was never a formal complaint because the jewelry appeared weeks later inside the girl's own purse. But by then, Elena had already been fired, and her name had been stained by whispers. In the second home, belonging to a businessman in New York City, the wife fired her after the husband praised her patience with the children too many times. Nothing happened. There was no proof of anything, but one jealous glance was enough to turn Elena into a threat. In the third, she was blamed for neglecting a child who fell while playing in the yard, even though she was preparing his food in the kitchen at the lady of the house's orders. Alexander read in silence. Each case was different, but they all had something in common. No accusation had been proven, and yet, Elena had always been the one to leave the poor one, the employee, the one who had no prominent last name to defend herself. But Eleanor didn't allow her son to draw that conclusion. She leaned toward him and spoke in a low voice, as if revealing a terrible truth. "A woman with so many scandals behind her doesn't enter a house by chance, Alexander. She enters because she knows where the cracks are." Alexander closed the folder forcefully. He didn't want to believe that. He had seen Elena with Matthew. He had seen the way the child calmed in her arms, as if breathing again after months underwater. But he was also a father, and a father's fear can turn any doubt into a huge shadow. He asked his mother what else she had found. Eleanor waited a second, savoring the final blow. "She lost a baby recently," she said, "and since then, according to the investigator, she lives alone, barely speaks to anyone, and avoids talking about her past. Don't you understand? That woman isn't saving Matthew. She's filling a void with your son." The phrase struck Alexander where it hurt most. because a part of him had also thought it, without daring to say it. Why did Elena love Matthew so much in such a short time? Why did she seem to understand him better than everyone else? Why did the child seek her out with such desperation? Until that moment, those questions seemed part of a miracle. Now, in Eleanor's mouth, they sounded like warnings. The next day, Alexander called Elena to the study. She arrived with Matthew asleep in her arms, wrapped in a light blanket, his face calmer than he had seen in months. Seeing his son like that almost made him regret it, but the folder on the desk reminded him that he couldn't close his eyes. He asked Sarah to take the baby for a few minutes. Matthew stirred uneasily when separated from Elena, but remained asleep. The door closed, and for the first time since she arrived at the mansion, Alexander looked at her not only with gratitude, but with suspicion. Elena felt it before he spoke. Her hands turned cold. Alexander asked her about her previous jobs. Elena lowered her gaze. She wasn't surprised. She knew that sooner or later, someone from the Sterling family would dig into her life as if poverty were a criminal record. She told him about the bracelet, about the jealous lady, about the child who fell. She didn't embellish anything. She didn't cry to convince him. She just spoke the truth with a tired dignity. I didn't leave those homes because I was guilty, Mr. Sterling. I left because a poor woman almost never wins when a rich family needs someone to blame. Alexander remained silent. That phrase hurt him because it sounded too real. Then he asked what he most feared to ask. And the baby you lost? Elena closed her eyes. The study, the fine furniture, the expensive carpet, everything disappeared for an instant. The smell of hospital, the cold sheet, the silence after a broken hope returned. When she opened her eyes, there were tears, but no shame. She told him yes, she had lost her son before she could hold him as she dreamed. She told him that since then she had lived with an absence lodged in her chest, but that Matthew was not a replacement. Matthew was Matthew, a living child, hungry for care, asking for help in the only language he had. Alexander wanted to believe her, but Eleanor had sown doubt too deeply. He asked her why she hadn't told him. Elena replied that it was because she knew exactly what would happen. They would use her pain to say she was crazy, confused, or sick with maternal love. Alexander remained silent, and that silence confirmed to Elena that she wasn't wrong. And if you also feel that Elena is being judged for loving a baby too much whom no one understood, write in the comments, I believe her. Because what Alexander was about to discover would not only change the way he saw Elena, it would put Matthew's life in danger again. At that moment, a weak cry came from the hallway. Matthew had woken up. At first it was a whimper, then a small, anxious cry. Elena turned her face immediately, as if every fiber of her body responded to that call. Alexander also got up, but before he could open the door, Eleanor entered without knocking. In her hand, she held another photograph taken from afar. In the back garden, Elena felt the world fall on her. The image showed the blanket partially covering Matthew, Eleanor's body bent over him, and although it didn't show everything clearly, it suggested enough to destroy her. Eleanor held up the photo with cruel calm. Now explain to my son what you're secretly giving his baby, Matthew cried louder behind the door. Alexander looked at the photograph, then at Elena, and all the air seemed to leave the study. She wanted to speak, but her voice failed her. Her secret, her pain, and the only nourishment that had calmed, Matthew had just fallen into the hands of the woman who most wanted to expel her. And as the baby's crying once again filled Sterling Manor, Alexander took a step back, hurt and confused, as if he no longer knew if Elena had come to save his son or to break what little trust he had left. But the worst wasn't the photograph. The worst was that if Alexander forbade her from approaching Matthew because of that truth, the baby would again be without the only nourishment his body accepted. And then, everyone would have to discover, in the most painful way, whether Elena's secret was a betrayal or the only reason Matthew was still alive. Alexander Sterling stared at the photograph, as if that image had split his trust in two. It wasn't clear proof, but it suggested too much. The blanket partially covered Matthew's body. Elena was leaning over him in the garden, and the explanation she had just given, that she had fed him breast milk, resonated in the study like an unerasable confession. Eleanor observed the scene with her arms crossed, silently satisfied, convinced that her son would finally open his eyes and expel that employee from the mansion. Elena denied nothing. With trembling hands and eyes full of tears, she explained that Matthew wouldn't accept the bottle, that she had watched him lose strength, that his little mouth sought nourishment desperately, and that she couldn't stand by idly. She said she never wanted to deceive Alexander, that she was scared, that she knew, if she spoke earlier, She would be judged as she was being judged now. But Alexander couldn't listen to her calmly. He felt humiliated, betrayed, as if someone had made a decision about his son behind his back, inside his own home. "You had no right," he said, his voice broken with rage and pain. "Matthew is my son, Elena, my son." She lowered her gaze. She didn't dispute that truth. Matthew was his son, but he was also a baby who was losing strength while everyone else sought elegant answers. Elena tried to tell him that she didn't do it to claim a place or to become indispensable, but because the child was suffering. Eleanor let out a bitter laugh and called it manipulation. She said a woman who had lost a baby might be confusing pain with motherhood, that perhaps she had created an unhealthy dependence, that the child no longer cried out of health concerns, but out of habit. Alexander, hurt by the lie, made a decision that seemed firm, correct, and necessary. He ordered Elena not to feed Matthew breast milk again. If the baby truly calmed with her, then she could hold him, sing to him, lull him, and help give him the bottle, but nothing more. Elena turned pale. She begged him not to stop abruptly, that Matthew wasn't ready, that his little body had already rejected everything else for months. Alexander clenched his jaw and replied that precisely because of that, they needed to break that dependence as soon as possible. The following hours were torture. Elena held Matthew tenderly, whispered to him, rocked him by the window, and tried to offer him the bottle as Alexander demanded. The baby rejected it again and again. First he turned his face, then he cried, then he pushed the nipple with his tongue and desperately sought Elena's breast, as if he didn't understand why the person who brought him calm was now denying him what his body craved. Each rejection was a stab for her. But Alexander watched from the door, serious, convinced that giving in would be worse. "He has to learn," he said, more to convince himself than Elena. "He's not learning, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her eyes damp. "He's starving." Eleanor intervened whenever she could, reminding Alexander not to be manipulated by tears. She said all children cried when a bad habit was taken away, that Matthew was throwing a tantrum because Elena had spoiled him. Elena felt angry, but didn't respond. How could she explain to such a harsh woman that a 5-month-old baby doesn't throw a tantrum over milk? How could she make her understand that hunger isn't disciplined, it's satisfied? On the first day, Matthew took barely a few drops. At night, he slept little, restless, sweating, waking with whimpers. On the second day, he rejected almost everything. Alexander called the pediatrician, but didn't tell him the whole truth. He just said the child was difficult again with feeding. The doctor advised monitoring, fluids, patience. Elena listened to those instructions with a sinking heart. She knew patience didn't feed. She knew that every hour without nourishment sent him back to the same abyss from which they had barely managed to pull him. On the third day, Matthew stopped crying forcefully, and that was what frightened Elena the most. He no longer screamed like before. He remained still, his eyes dull, his mouth dry, and his body too limp in her arms. When she spoke to him, he tried to respond with a weak gesture, but then immediately closed his eyes. Alexander's face began to lose color. The house regained that terrible silence of the previous days. Not the silence of peace, but that of a tragedy tiptoeing closer. "Please, look at him," Elena said, standing in front of Alexander with Matthew in her arms. "This isn't dependence, this is hunger." Alexander wanted to respond, but he couldn't find the words. He took his son and felt how light he was, his skin warm, his lips parched. He tried to give him the bottle one more time. Matthew didn't even have the strength to angrily reject it. He just let the milk wet his mouth and then trickle out the corner. Elena covered her face with a hand to keep from breaking down. Eleanor, for the first time, said nothing. That afternoon, Matthew vomited the little he had managed to swallow and lay pale, too still, his breathing weak. Alexander felt his pride turn into terror. The photograph no longer mattered. Whether Elena had lied no longer mattered. Who was right no longer mattered. He only saw his son fading again before him. "Call the doctor," he ordered, his voice trembling, but Elena shook her head desperately. "There's no time to wait at home. We have to take him to the hospital now." Alexander looked at Matthew, then at Elena, and this time he didn't argue. They left the mansion in a silent hurry, with Sarah running behind with a blanket and Eleanor praying fragmented words that no longer sounded like judgment, but like true fear. In the car, Elena held Matthew against her chest, unable to feed him, feeling the baby weakly searching for what she was forbidden to give him. Alexander drove with a tense jaw, his eyes fixed on the road, but inside, something was breaking. He had wanted to regain control. He had wanted to protect his son from a lie. And now, looking in the rearview mirror at Matthew, almost lifeless in Elena's arms, he began to fear that his pride had committed a cruelty greater than any secret. When they arrived at the hospital, a nurse immediately took the baby and called the pediatrician urgently. Elena remained in the hallway with empty hands, feeling her heart being ripped out. Alexander looked at her for just a second, but said nothing. He didn't know how to apologize. Not yet. The doors closed in front of them, and as Matthew's weak cry faded behind the emergency room, Alexander Sterling understood that perhaps he had forbidden the only thing keeping his son alive. The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant, stale coffee, and fear. Alexander Sterling paced back and forth, his shirt wrinkled, his face pale, his hands clenched as if still holding Matthew. Elena remained seated on a metal bench, her gaze fixed on the emergency doors, feeling an anguish in her body that she couldn't explain without revealing how much she already loved that child. Eleanor prayed standing by the wall, but this time she didn't have her usual self-assurance. Her lips moved, though her eyes were fixed on the door through which her grandson had been taken. After almost an hour, Dr. Daniel Adams emerged with a folder in hand and a seriousness that made Alexander stop pacing. He wasn't a dramatic or exaggerated doctor, so when he asked to speak with them privately, Elena felt her heart sink. Alexander wanted to know if Matthew was okay, and the doctor took a deep breath before explaining that the baby was stable, but presented a concerning picture of moderate dehydration, recent weight loss, and severe feeding refusal. He didn't say it to blame anyone. He said it with that cold clarity that medical truths have when they can no longer be embellished. Alexander stood still. Eleanor clutched her rosary. Elena closed her eyes because every word confirmed what she had tried to warn them about. The doctor continued, saying that at the last checkup, Matthew had shown clear signs of improvement: better color, better sleep, weight gain, less irritability, and more responsiveness to touch. But now, after several days without accepting sufficient nourishment, the child had dangerously regressed. They couldn't treat this as a simple tantrum or a bad habit. A 5-month-old baby who stops feeding isn't challenging anyone. He's at risk. Eleanor tried to intervene, saying the employee had created an unhealthy dependence, that the child needed to learn to feed normally, and that it wasn't healthy to allow an outsider to control him that way. The doctor looked at her respectfully, but without yielding. He explained that from a clinical standpoint, the important thing was to protect the baby's nutrition and stability. If Matthew was accepting breast milk and improving with it, abruptly cutting off that source of nourishment and comfort could provoke precisely what they were seeing: stress, feeding refusal, dehydration, and general deterioration. Alexander lowered his gaze as if each word struck him. He asked what they should do then, and the doctor was direct: maintain what was working, supervise it, document it, and when Matthew was strong, begin a gradual transition to other forms of feeding without suddenly severing the bond that was giving him security. He added that forcing him to change overnight could be painful, not only physically but emotionally, because the baby had already experienced too much anguish since his first months of life. Elena listened in silence, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt no triumph. She didn't think, "I was right." All she felt was relief mixed with sadness, because Matthew had had to worsen for someone to believe her, because the love she had given him was still treated with suspicion, and because she knew that even if the doctor spoke in her favor, it didn't mean Alexander would trust her again. When they were allowed in, Matthew was in an observation bed with an IV drip and his eyes half closed. Elena felt like running to him, but she stopped. She waited for permission. That gesture made Alexander look at her. In his eyes was weariness, guilt, and a hardness that was no longer anger, but fear. The doctor indicated that she could feed him, always calmly and under supervision. Alexander hesitated for just an instant, then nodded. Elena approached slowly, took Matthew with an almost reverent tenderness, and covered him with a blanket. There were no words, just the sound of a baby who, feeling her near, stopped whimpering and sought nourishment with a weakness that broke the soul. Alexander looked away for a second, not out of rejection, but because seeing it hurt him too much. Matthew wasn't manipulated. Matthew was in need, and Elena, with all her pain, was the only one who had known how to respond. Hours later, when the doctor confirmed that the baby was reacting better and could return home with strict monitoring, the drive back was silent. Eleanor was in another car, furious at having lost ground. In the main vehicle, Alexander drove. Elena sat in the back with Matthew asleep in her arms, and between them was an uncomfortable truth. She had saved him, but she had also lied to him. He had wanted to protect him, but had almost put him in danger. Halfway home, Alexander pulled over next to a quiet avenue under the yellow glow of streetlights. He didn't turn around immediately. He stared at the steering wheel, as if the words weighed too heavily, and said that Elena would feed Matthew for as long as necessary, as the doctor had indicated. Without hiding, without lies, and with supervision, Elena felt her eyes fill with tears. She pressed Matthew a little closer to her chest, grateful, but Alexander wasn't finished yet. With a voice colder than his heart truly felt, he added that when Matthew was strong, when he could feed himself in another way, she would have to leave. The phrase fell inside the car like a closing door. Elena didn't respond immediately. She looked at the sleeping baby, his calm face, his small fingers clinging to the blanket, and felt her soul break. She wanted to say no, that she couldn't, that Matthew was already part of her life, that separating from him would be losing a child again. But true love, she understood in that instant, sometimes doesn't ask how much it hurts, it asks what the other needs to live. Elena accepted softly. She told him that if that was what Alexander wanted, she would leave when Matthew no longer needed her. But until that day, she begged him to let her care for him well, not for her sake, but for his. Alexander didn't know how to respond. He expected resistance, complaints, pleas, but Elena had just agreed to lose the baby for his health. That response made something stir in his chest, something that had been dormant for a long time since Victoria's death. The car started moving again. Elena looked out the window with Matthew asleep in her arms, shedding silent tears that no one should notice. Alexander drove without saying anything, but he no longer saw a lying employee in the back seat. He saw a woman capable of loving without holding back anything. And that kind of love, though he still wouldn't admit it, was beginning to change everything. In the following days, Sterling Manor changed its rhythm. Matthew's endless crying no longer pierced the walls from dawn. There were no more nurses entering and leaving with defeated faces, no more untouched bottles accumulating on silver trays. Under Alexander's watchful eye, and with Dr. Daniel Adams's guidance, Elena fed the baby at established times, carefully, without hiding, without a single lie more. And though each time she did, she felt the weight of Eleanor's gaze on her back, she also saw Matthew regain his color, his sleep, and that quiet peace that only babies have when they finally stop fighting hunger. Alexander observed everything from a certain distance. At first, he did so out of distrust, like someone watching a wound to make sure it didn't bleed again. But little by little, without realizing it, he began to look differently. He saw Elena wash her hands before taking Matthew, cover him delicately, speak softly to him, await his pauses, not impose anything on him, not use him to seek attention. And every time the baby fell asleep on her, satisfied and calm, Alexander felt something inside him unravel. That woman did not behave like someone who wanted to conquer a mansion. She behaved like someone willing to lose everything, so that a child might live. The phrase Elena had said in the car repeated in his head, "I will leave when Matthew no longer needs me." Alexander couldn't understand that kind of love. In his world, almost everything came with conditions, contracts, last names, conveniences, hidden interests. But Elena didn't ask for jewels, didn't ask for a better room, didn't ask to be called Mrs. or to be thanked in front of anyone. She asked for time to feed the baby and permission to care for him well, nothing more. And that nothing more began to weigh more heavily on him than any elegant promise he had heard in the drawing rooms of Greenwich. One afternoon, Alexander found her in Matthew's room, silently arranging the baby's clothes. The child slept in his crib, breathing calmly, one little hand open on the blanket. Elena folded the diapers with an almost sad patience. Alexander stood at the doorway without entering, remembering Victoria, Matthew's mother, doing the same thing months before she died. Victoria had been a light in that mansion, cheerful, stubborn, full of life. Her death left Alexander with a newborn son, an immense house, and a pain he couldn't name. Since then, he hadn't felt like a man again. He had felt like a widower, a frightened father, and the owner of a silence that was devouring him. Elena noticed his presence and stiffened, as if still expecting a reproach. Alexander asked her not to be scared. He hadn't come to argue. He just wanted to know if Matthew had eaten well. She replied yes, that he had rested better, that if they continued like this, they could soon gradually start trying other forms of feeding without forcing him. She spoke with such honesty, even knowing that this progress brought her closer to her own farewell, that Alexander felt a pang in his chest. He realized Elena was helping Matthew not to need her, even if that meant being without the baby, who had given meaning back to her life. "Doesn't it hurt?" he asked almost without thinking. Elena looked up. For a moment, she didn't feign strength. Her eyes filled with a quiet, deep sadness, but not bitterness. She told him, of course it hurt. It hurt more than he could imagine. But loving Matthew didn't mean tying him to her. Loving Matthew meant seeing him healthy, even if afterwards she had to walk out the same door she entered, with her old bag and a broken heart. Alexander didn't respond. He felt those words touch a place that had been closed for months since Victoria's death, because he too had confused loving with holding on, suffering with honoring, controlling with protecting. That night, after Matthew fell asleep, Alexander went down to the kitchen and found Elena making tea for Sarah, who had been suffering from a sore throat for days. The scene was simple, almost invisible. An employee heating water, looking for honey, worrying about someone who couldn't offer anything in return. But Alexander looked at her as if seeing for the first time the true size of her heart. Elena didn't love to win. She loved because she couldn't look at pain and remain still. And that humble truth began to open a luminous crack in the millionaire's sadness. From then on, Alexander began to look for excuses to be near. He asked about Matthew's schedule, even though he already knew. He went down to the garden when Elena took the baby out for air. He stayed a few more minutes in the room, listening to her sing songs she had learned from her midwife grandmother in rural Georgia. Once, while Matthew slept between them, Elena spoke of Grandma Rosa, the woman who taught her that babies don't cry to annoy, but to tell what the world doesn't yet understand. Alexander listened in silence, imagining that poor child learning to care for small lives while he grew up surrounded by employees who solved everything for him. For the first time, he saw no distance between their worlds. He saw a strength he had never possessed. But Eleanor saw it too, and that infuriated her. The lady began to enter without warning whenever Eleanor was with Matthew. She corrected the way she arranged the blanket, criticized the baby's clothes, asked Sarah to check everything Elena touched. If Alexander praised his son's improvement, Eleanor said there was no need to exaggerate. If Matthew smiled in Elena's arms, she murmured that children get attached to anyone who pleases them. If Elena remained silent, she called her calculating. If she spoke, she called her insolent. Her goal was not to care for the baby, it was to wear down the woman who was gaining a place she never wanted to concede. Elena endured without responding. She had learned that some battles are lost when one defends oneself too much, but Alexander began to notice every gesture, every humiliation disguised as advice, every phrase thrown to remind Elena that she was still an employee. And with each injustice, the admiration he felt for her mingled with something more dangerous, more intimate, more difficult to deny. One afternoon, Eleanor found Alexander watching Elena from the corridor, while she made Matthew laugh with a simple song. The baby let out a small, clean giggle, the first that truly echoed in that mansion in months. Alexander smiled without realizing it. Eleanor saw that smile and understood that the problem was no longer just Matthew. Her son was beginning to look at Elena as a man looks at a woman who can give him back his life. That night, Eleanor closed her bedroom door, picked up the phone, and called an old friend from Greenwich high society. Her voice was cold, calculated, filled with elegant venom. "I need people to know what's happening in this house," she said. "My son is being manipulated by an employee, and if we don't do something now, that woman is going to take everything." Eleanor Sterling knew how to move in high society, as other women know how to pray the rosary with patience, repetition, and an absolute faith in the power of appearances. She didn't need to shout to destroy someone. A well-placed call was enough, a phrase spoken with apparent concern, a dramatic pause before uttering Elena Santos's name. That same night, she began to sow the story among her lifelong friends. Women with long last names, discreet jewels, and smiles capable of cutting like glass. She told them she was worried about Alexander, that since Victoria's death her son was vulnerable, that a newly arrived employee had taken advantage of the house's grief to make herself indispensable. At first, the friends listened with curiosity, but Eleanor knew how to turn curiosity into scandal. She spoke of Matthew, of the baby who wouldn't eat, of the strange way he only calmed with Elena, of the breast milk given in secret for supposed emotional dependence the employee had created to control the child and, through the child, also control the father. She didn't say the doctor had recommended maintaining what worked. She didn't say Matthew had been dehydrated or that he had improved thanks to that care. The complete truth didn't serve her purpose. She needed a truncated, elegant, and poisonous truth. In less than 3 days, rumors were already flying around Greenwich. In private salons, charity lunches, and ladies' groups who pretended to talk about philanthropy while devouring other people's reputations. Elena's name began to sound like a warning. They said the employee had enchanted the child, that Alexander Sterling, widowed and alone, had fallen into an emotional trap, that a poor woman knew very well how to use pity to enter a rich family. No one asked about Matthew. No one wanted to know if the baby was better. The important thing was the scandal. An employee feeding the heir, a millionaire defending a woman without a prominent last name, a mansion where class rules seemed to be breaking. Elena began to feel the weight of these rumors, even before hearing them directly. The chauffeur stopped greeting her naturally. One of the cooks fell silent when she entered. Sarah, though still treating her with respect, looked at her with impotent sadness. And when Elena accompanied Alexander to Matthew's checkup, two ladies in the waiting room observed her from head to toe and murmured something she couldn't fully hear, but understood. That's her. Elena clutched Matthew to her chest, not to hide him, but to steady herself. Alexander also started receiving calls. Business partners who asked with false discretion if everything was all right at home. Cousins who insinuated he should guard the Sterling name's reputation. An aunt from Boston told him that, perhaps for the child's sake, he should hire a reputable institution and get that woman out before everything became more difficult. Alexander listened, hung up, and felt a different kind of rage growing. It wasn't the desperate rage from before. It was a clear, protective rage, born of seeing how everyone opined about Elena without having seen her spend entire nights caring for Matthew. One afternoon, upon returning from the clinic, Elena found an envelope under the service room door. Inside was a typed note. Women like you always end up destroying families that don't belong to you. There was no signature. None was needed. Elena sat on the narrow bed with the paper in her hands, feeling the past repeating itself. Another rich house, another accusation. Again, she was made guilty of someone else's desire, someone else's fear, a wound she didn't cause. But this time it hurt more because Matthew was in the middle. That night, after putting the baby to sleep, Elena went to Alexander's study. She didn't want to, but dignity sometimes demands saying goodbye before being dismissed. She told him that perhaps it was better to accelerate the transition, find donated milk, hire someone else, find any way for her to leave the mansion as soon as possible. Alexander listened in silence, his expression hardening, not against her, but against the injustice. Elena tried to smile, but her voice broke as she said she didn't want to be the cause of another scandal in Matthew's life. Alexander slowly stood up, walked towards her, and took the note from her hands. He read it without saying anything. Then, he laid it on the desk, as if it were something dirty. He asked her if she truly believed that leaving would protect Matthew. Elena lowered her gaze. She said she didn't know, but if staying brought shame to the child, she preferred to bear the pain herself. Alexander took a deep breath. At that moment, he understood that Eleanor and high society could invent 1,000 versions of Elena, but none explained what was before him. A woman willing to lose her place so as not to stain the future of a baby who didn't even share her blood. "You are not a shame to my son," Alexander said in a low voice. "The shame would be to let him be raised by people who speak of family but don't know how to love." Elena looked at him, surprised. Alexander moved a little closer, still not touching her, as if understanding that every gesture between them had to be made with respect. He told her that at first he had doubted her, that the lie had hurt him, that he still struggled to accept that she hadn't told him the truth from the beginning. But he also told her that he had seen her sacrifice, her way of caring for Matthew, her decision to leave when the child was well, even if it broke her soul, and that no hidden interest resembled that. Elena began to cry silently. They weren't tears of defeat, but of someone who was finally being seen without prejudice. Alexander confessed that since Victoria's death, he believed his capacity for love had ended, that he only had to be a father and survive. But Elena had entered his house in a simple uniform and with a huge wound, and yet she had given Matthew back his life and him something he no longer expected to feel. He didn't yet pronounce the word love, but it was in his eyes, in the way his voice trembled, in the silence that remained between them. Then the study door opened. Eleanor appeared without knocking, as if that house still belonged more to her than to her own son. She saw Elena crying. She saw Alexander standing, too close, and her face filled with an almost theatrical indignation. She said she understood everything now, that the employee didn't just want the baby, she also wanted the father. Elena took a step back, hurt, but Alexander didn't retreat. For the first time, he faced his mother without fear. He told her that Elena hadn't sought this house, that the house needed her, that Matthew was alive because she dared to do what everyone judged before understanding. Eleanor replied that a Sterling would never accept such a woman into the family. Alexander, tired of the word family being used as a weapon, looked at Elena with a decision that transformed his face. "Then perhaps it's time to decide what family truly means," he said. Elena opened her eyes, not understanding. Eleanor paled. Alexander walked towards Elena, not impulsively, but with a certainty born of all they had suffered. He took her hands carefully, as if recognizing in them the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the tenderness, and the strength that had saved Matthew. Then, in front of his indignant mother, he said he didn't want Elena to leave when Matthew was well. He wanted her to stay with dignity, with respect, with a place no one could take away from her with rumors. Elena shook her head, frightened. She reminded him that everyone would talk, that his mother would never accept it, that she was an employee and he a Sterling. Alexander looked at her with a gentle sadness. He told her he was tired of a last name that served to close doors and of a society that confused money with worth. Matthew needed love, and so did he. And Elena, without asking for anything, had given them both a reason to live. Then, before Eleanor could stop him, Alexander Sterling knelt before Elena in the middle of the study. There was no music, no flowers, no guests, only a furious mother, a humble woman trembling with fear, and a man who was finally choosing with his heart. "Elena Santos," he said, his voice broken, "marry me, not to silence gossip, not out of pity, not just for Matthew. Marry me because I love you, because my son loves you, and because this house stopped being dead the moment you entered it." Eleanor let out a, "It can't be," full of rage. Elena covered her mouth, crying, unable to respond. And from the room upstairs, as if fate also wanted to speak, Matthew woke and let out a brief cry, not of pain, but of a call. Elena looked toward the stairs, then at Alexander kneeling before her, and understood that her life had just hung suspended between two paths: to flee to avoid humiliation, or to accept a love that could face an entire city. Eleanor Sterling didn't scream anymore that night. After seeing Alexander kneeling before Elena, proposing marriage in the mansion's study, something in her face hardened in a different way. It was no longer just rage, it was wounded pride. It was the certainty of a woman accustomed to commanding, who had just lost authority in front of an employee. She looked at her son as if she didn't recognize him. She looked at Elena as if she wanted to erase her presence with her eyes, and left the study without saying goodbye, leaving behind a silence more menacing than any insult. The next morning, Eleanor had her things packed and moved to one of the family properties in Greenwich's exclusive countryside. She said she had no intention of staying under the same roof where a stranger had enchanted her son and usurped Victoria's place. Alexander didn't try to stop her. It hurt him to see her leave because she was still his mother, but he also understood that some distances are necessary when a person's love turns into control. Elena, however, felt guilty. She didn't want to separate a mother from her son. She didn't want to enter a family leaving ruins behind. But Alexander calmly took her hand and told her it wasn't she who was breaking the house. It was Eleanor's pride, which couldn't bear to see Matthew healthy and him alive again. For several weeks, the mansion breathed a strange peace. Matthew continued to improve. Dr. Daniel carefully supervised the transition, and little by little, the baby began to accept small amounts of other foods, without rushing, without punishment, without abruptly severing the bond that had saved him. Elena continued to care for him with a tenderness that no one could deny anymore. And Alexander, growing more certain of his decision each day, began to plan a simple wedding, away from the social noise. But Eleanor had not given up. From her other house, she moved calls, invitations, and favors like chess pieces. If she couldn't prevent the engagement in private, she would try to destroy it in public. A month later, Alexander received a formal invitation to a charity gala organized by his mother. It was one of those parties where Greenwich's high society gathered to talk about generosity while measuring last names, dresses, and marriages. Elena immediately knew it wasn't an innocent invitation. She asked Alexander not to go, that they didn't need to expose themselves, that she had endured enough stares, but Alexander refused to hide her. He said that if she was going to be his wife, it wouldn't be through the service entrance or in silence. They would go together, heads held high. The night of the gala, Elena wore a simple ivory suit that Sarah helped her adjust. She wore no expensive jewelry or a magazine hairstyle, but there was a dignity in her that no designer dress could buy. Still, as she entered the ballroom on Alexander's arm, she felt dozens of gazes pierce her. Some women stopped talking, Others smiled with feigned pity. Men looked at Alexander as if he were committing an elegant folly. Eleanor greeted them from afar, impeccable, with a pearl necklace and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The murmurs started soon. They said that was the employee, that was the woman who fed the baby, that was the one who managed to keep the millionaire. Elena gripped Alexander's arm, trying not to tremble. He leaned in slightly and whispered for her to breathe, that she wasn't alone. But Eleanor had not organized that night to allow them to walk peacefully. Near the end of dinner, she went up to the small stage, took the microphone, and thanked everyone for attending. She spoke of family, tradition, values, and the importance of protecting children from wrong influences. Every word seemed elegant, but Elena knew it was a dagger wrapped in velvet. Then Eleanor called Alexander to the stage. She said with a perfect smile that her son had something very important to announce to everyone. The room fell silent. Elena felt her heart stop. She understood the trap. Eleanor wanted to force Alexander to speak of his engagement in the middle of a room full of people ready to judge him. She wanted him to be ashamed. She wanted Elena to feel small. She wanted to turn their love into a spectacle. Alexander slowly went up to the stage, took the microphone, and looked at his mother. For a few seconds, no one knew what he was going to say. Then he looked for Elena among the crowd. She stood by the table, pale, her eyes full of fear, but not hiding. That image gave him strength. Alexander said yes. He had an announcement that he planned to marry Elena Santos. The murmurs grew like a wave. Some people looked at each other scandalized. Others feigned surprise, although they already knew from Eleanor's gossip. But Alexander didn't stop. He said that Elena didn't come from a rich family, that she didn't have a long last name or a fortune behind her, that she had entered his house in a simple uniform and an old bag. Then he paused and added that precisely because of that, many had felt entitled to judge her without knowing her. Alexander's voice grew firmer. He recounted that Matthew, his son, was on the verge of being lost amidst diagnoses, pride, and fear. He recounted that many people with titles failed to hear what a humble woman did hear, that a baby wasn't throwing a tantrum, but crying for help. He didn't reveal intimate details to humiliate her or turn her pain into a spectacle. He only said that Elena saved Matthew with care, patience, and a love so great that she even agreed to leave when the child no longer needed her. Then he looked at the entire room and said that, if that was self-interest, he hoped the world had more people interested in loving without holding back anything. The silence changed. It was no longer mockery, it was discomfort. Some women lowered their gaze. An older man, a family friend, slowly began to applaud. Then another person, then another. Eleanor turned pale, realizing that her trap was turning against her. Elena had tears in her eyes. Not from shame, but because for the first time someone from that world spoke of her without reducing her to her poverty. Alexander came down from the stage, walked towards Elena, and in front of everyone, knelt again. The entire room stood still. He took her hands carefully and said he had already asked her once in private, but now he wanted to do it in front of all who had doubted her, not to prove anything to them, but so that no one would ever again say that Elena Santos had secretly entered the Sterling family. "Elena Santos," he said, his voice emotional, "will you marry me and, with Matthew, form the family that pain almost stole from us?" Elena cried uncontrollably. She looked at Eleanor, who stood stiff by the stage. She looked at the people who had judged her, and then she looked at Alexander, the man who had finally decided to love her without hiding her. Her voice trembling but clear, she replied, "Yes." Applause filled the room. Not everyone applauded out of love. Some did it out of shame, others out of surprise, others because the truth, when spoken directly, forces one to lower their eyes. Eleanor retreated without saying goodbye, defeated by the very stage she had prepared to humiliate. And Elena, embraced by Alexander, in the midst of the high society that wanted to destroy her, understood that perhaps love doesn't erase wounds all at once, but it can give them a place to stop bleeding. Alexander Sterling and Elena Santos's wedding wasn't the ostentatious party that high society expected. There were no halls filled with politicians, no tables with names of prominent families, no photographers seeking the most convenient angle. They married one clear morning in a small chapel in Greenwich, with Matthew in Sarah's arms, Dr. Daniel as a witness, and a few people who had learned to love Elena without asking her how much money she had. Alexander waited for her at the altar, his eyes filled with quiet emotion, and when she entered in her simple, ivory dress, he understood that true love doesn't always arrive with mariachi music or perfect promises. Sometimes it arrives with a humble woman who dares to save what everyone had given up for lost. Matthew, already stronger, let out a small laugh during the ceremony, as if giving his own blessing. Elena cried as she recited her vows because she promised to love Alexander without forgiveness, to respect the history of that house, and to care for Matthew not as a trophy or a prize, but as the child God placed in her path when both were broken. Alexander promised never again to let pride speak louder than love. He promised to defend her against the world, but also to listen to her in silence, because she had taught him that sometimes those with the least are those who know best how to care. Eleanor did not attend. She sent a white floral arrangement without a card, and no one knew if it was a sign of peace or disguised pride. For years, she remained distant, living in one of the family properties, receiving news through others, and pretending not to care. But occasionally, her chauffeur would drive slowly past Sterling Manor, and she would look from the car window as Matthew ran through the garden, healthy, strong, happy, calling Elena Mom with a naturalness that squeezed Eleanor's heart. 5 years later, the house that once seemed like a museum was full of life. Matthew was now a bright, mischievous boy, with the shining eyes of one who was loved back to health. Elena continued to sing him Grandma Rosa's songs, and Alexander, every time he heard them, remembered the first time that voice stopped his son's crying. Then another blessing arrived. Elena became pregnant with a girl. When Lily Sterling Santos was born, Matthew greeted her with a clumsy kiss on the forehead and promised to care for her, just like Mom cared for me. Alexander hugged Elena in the hospital and whispered that she hadn't just saved Matthew, she had saved them all. Years passed with birthdays, toys strewn in the living room, family breakfasts, and laughter where there had once been only fear. But Elena noticed something. Every afternoon, an elegant SUV would stop in the distance outside the gate. Inside was Eleanor, watching her grandchildren play without daring to get out. Matthew sometimes asked about his dad's mom, and Lily, with her childlike innocence, said she wanted to meet the grandma who lived far away. Elena never spoke ill of her. She knew that pride could also be a prison, and that some people need someone to open the door from the outside. One afternoon, while Matthew and Lily played in the garden, Elena took both of their hands and walked to the gate. Eleanor, surprised, wanted to ask the chauffeur to drive off, but it was too late. Elena approached calmly and told her that the children always asked about their dad's mother, that they wanted to meet their grandmother, and that if she accepted, there was fresh coffee in the house. Eleanor looked at Matthew, then at Lily, and for the first time in years her eyes filled with tears, not of pride. The lady slowly got out of the car. Matthew greeted her with curiosity. Lily offered her a flower plucked from the garden, and Eleanor brought a hand to her chest, as if that tenderness was more than she deserved. She looked at Elena and with a broken voice admitted that she had been very wrong about her, that she had judged her for being poor, for being an employee, for having loved without asking permission. Elena smiled with gentle sadness and replied that everyone deserves a chance when they are willing to change. That afternoon, Eleanor re-entered the mansion, not as owner, but as a grandmother. That night, when the children were asleep and Eleanor had left, promising to return the next day, Alexander found Elena on the terrace, hugged her from behind, and thanked her for forgiving his mother, for giving her a chance when no one demanded it. Elena looked at the garden lights and replied that a family isn't complete when everyone is right, but when someone dares to heal what pride broke. Alexander kissed her forehead. Inside the house, Matthew and Lily slept peacefully. Outside, the wind gently stirred the bougainvillea in the garden, where Elena had once secretly fed the baby no one knew how to save. And so the employee who arrived with an old bag, a hidden pain, and a love that asked for nothing, ended up becoming the heart of the Sterling family. Because sometimes miracles don't arrive dressed in luxury. Sometimes they arrive with humble hands, with silent tears, and with the love of a mother who decides to save a child, even if the whole world doesn't understand. And from that day on, every time Matthew hugged Elena and called her mom, Alexander remembered that his son wasn't saved by money, or by a last name, or by pride. He was saved because a humble woman had the courage to love when everyone else only knew how to judge. If this story touched your heart, subscribe right now, because here we tell stories where love, humility, and miracles change destinies that seemed lost. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Elena's place? Would you have risked your job, your reputation, and your heart to save Matthew? Comment more like this if you want another equally exciting story, one of those that begin with tears, secrets, and pain, but end by reminding us that true love always finds a way to conquer. Subscribe if you cried, comment more like this, and share this story with someone who still believes that miracles exist.